Jake Morrison pressed his face against the massive viewing window and stared at the swirling clouds below. The gas giant Narration Prime stretched endlessly in all directions, its purple and orange atmosphere dancing in patterns that made his eyes water. Even after 3 months at the Kepler Interstellar Academy, he still couldn't believe he was actually here. The academy was huge. Jake had seen pictures before arriving, but nothing prepared him for the real thing. The station was like a floating city, with gleaming metal corridors that seemed to go on forever. Thousands of beings from dozens of different worlds lived and studied here, all training to join the galactic fleet. Jake walked down the main corridor, his footsteps echoing on the polished floor. Other cadets moved past him, chattering in languages he couldn't understand. Some looked almost human, while others were so strange he had to stop himself from staring. There were beings made of what looked like living crystal, others that floated instead of walked, and some that seemed to be made of pure energy. He was one of only 3 humans in the entire academy. The other 2 were Lisa Kane from New York and Pete Collins from Texas. They stuck together most of the time, knowing they were considered the primitive ones among all these advanced species. Jake's first class of the day was Advanced Quantum Engineering. He slipped into the classroom and took his usual seat in the back row. The instructor, a tall being called Professor Veltar, had skin that shifted colors when he talked. Today it was a pale blue, which Jake had learned meant the professor was in a good mood. Today we will study the harmonic resonance patterns of dark matter manipulation, Professor Veltar announced, his skin flickering to a deeper blue. As you all know, this is elementary level material for most civilized species. Jake sighed and opened his datapad. The symbols on the screen might as well have been written in an alien language. Actually, they were written in an alien language. Standard Galactic was hard enough to read, but the math and science terms were impossible for him to understand. Around him, other cadets were already working on the problems. Zixthara, a crystalline being from the Vorthan Empire, was solving equations by making her body glow in different patterns. Her species communicated through light, and somehow they could do math the same way. Next to her, Gleep was using his tentacles to work on 6 different problems at once. The Moldari were known for their incredible multitasking abilities. In the front row, Kiravan sat perfectly still with her eyes closed. The Elonians were telepathic, so she was probably reading the answers directly from the professor's mind. Jake envied her ability, even though he knew it was considered rude to use telepathy in class. "Mr. Morrison," Professor Veltar called out, his skin shifting to yellow. "Perhaps you would like to share your solution to Problem 7. Jake looked down at his datapad. He had barely understood Problem 1, let alone Problem 7. Still working on it, sir." The professor's skin turned orange, which Jake recognized as annoyance. "The solution is quite simple. Even a first-year cadet from a Type 2 civilization should be able to handle basic dark matter calculations." A few of the other cadets made sounds that Jake had learned were laughter in their various languages. His cheeks burned with embarrassment. Everyone knew that humans came from what the galaxy classified as a Type 1 civilization. They had only achieved faster-than-light travel 50 years ago, making them babies compared to species that had been traveling between stars for thousands of years. After class, Jake hurried to his next subject. Primitive problem-solving was held in a different section of the academy, in rooms that looked much older and simpler than the high-tech classrooms. The instructor was Commander Hayes, one of the few humans on the teaching staff. "Good morning, cadets," Commander Hayes said as Jake and about 20 other students filed into the room. "Today we're going to talk about what to do when your technology fails." Most of the alien cadets looked bored. Jake had overheard some of them talking about this class in the hallways. They called it Stone Age Studies and complained that it was a waste of time. After all, their civilizations had eliminated most problems through advanced planning and backup systems. "Let's start with a simple scenario," Commander Hayes continued. "Your ship has crashed on a planet with no breathable atmosphere. Your life support systems are failing, and you have no way to call for help. What do you do?" Zixthara raised one of her crystalline appendages. We would use our emergency beacon to transmit a distress signal on 17 different frequencies, while simultaneously activating our environmental suit's extended life support protocols. What if your emergency beacon is broken? Commander Hayes asked. Then we would use the backup beacon. What if that's broken too? Then we would use the tertiary system. Commander Hayes smiled. What if all your technology is destroyed? What if you only have basic materials and your own knowledge? The room went quiet. Jake could see the confusion on the faces of his classmates. For most of them, a world without technology was impossible to imagine. Jake, Commander Hayes called. What would you do? Jake thought for a moment. I guess I'd look for materials to build a shelter first. Maybe use parts from the ship wreckage. Then I'd try to find a way to signal for help using mirrors or fire, something that could be seen from space. Good thinking, Commander Hayes nodded. Anyone else? The other cadets looked uncomfortable. One of them, a floating being called Vrix, spoke up, but why would we need to know such primitive methods? Our ships have multiple backup systems. The probability of total system failure is less than 0.001%. Because, Commander Hayes replied, in the real universe impossible. Things happen every day. The galaxy is full of surprises, and sometimes the most advanced technology can't save you. Sometimes you need to think like your ancestors did. After class, Jake walked to the cafeteria with his usual group. Lisa and Pete were already there, sitting at their normal table by the window. They had learned to stick together, especially during meals. The food dispensers were designed for dozens of different species, and it took time to figure out what was safe for humans to eat. How was quantum engineering? Lisa asked as Jake sat down with his tray. Terrible, Jake replied. I think I understood maybe 10% of what the professor was talking about. At least you're not failing stellar navigation like I am, Pete said. Apparently humans have terrible spatial reasoning compared to most species. That's not true, Lisa argued. We're just different. Our brains work differently than theirs. Jake nodded, but he wasn't sure if being different was enough. Every day he felt more and more like he didn't belong here. The other cadets were so far ahead of him in everything. They had been raised with technology that seemed like magic to him. Their species had been traveling between stars since before humans had invented the wheel. Hey, look at that, Pete said, pointing out the window. Jake turned to see what his friend was looking at. In the distance, he could see storm clouds forming in the gas giant's atmosphere. They were huge, bigger than anything he had ever seen. On Earth, the clouds were dark and angry-looking, with flashes of lightning flickering inside them. That's strange, Lisa said. The weather report said it would be calm today. Jake watched the storm growing larger and darker. Something about it made him nervous, though he couldn't say why. Back on Earth, he had seen plenty of storms. His family lived in Kansas, right in the middle of Tornado Alley. He had learned to read weather patterns from his grandfather, who had been a farmer. This storm looked different, though. It was moving too fast and growing too quickly. The clouds were spinning in a way that reminded him of the hurricanes he had seen on the news, but much bigger and more violent. We should probably head back to our dorms, Jake said. That storm looks like it's going to be bad. His friends looked at him strangely. The Academy shields can handle any weather, Pete said. They've been tested against storms 100 times worse than that. Jake nodded, but he kept watching the clouds. His grandfather had always told him to trust his instincts when it came to weather. Right now, his instincts were telling him that something was very wrong. The storm was still growing, and it was heading straight for them. The storm hit 3 hours later. Just as Jake had feared it would, he was in his dorm room studying when the first alarm sounded. The lights flickered and the station shuddered slightly. Jake looked up from his datapad and listened. The alarm was different from the usual drill signals. This one was urgent, almost panicked. Through his small window, Jake could see the storm clouds had completely surrounded the academy. They were massive, dark walls of swirling gas that seemed to go on forever. Lightning flashed constantly inside them, creating a light show that would have been beautiful if it wasn't so terrifying. His door chimed, and Pete rushed in without waiting for permission. Did you feel that? Pete asked, his face pale. The whole station just moved. Yeah, I felt it, Jake replied, standing up. We need to find Lisa and get to the emergency assembly points. They hurried through the corridors, which were now filled with confused cadets. The lights kept flickering, and Jake could hear strange creaking sounds coming from the walls. The station was built to handle atmospheric pressure, but something was wrong. They found Lisa in the main corridor, standing with a group of other cadets. Everyone looked worried, even the alien species that usually seemed so confident and in control. What's happening? Lisa asked when she saw them. Before anyone could answer, the lights went out completely. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, bathing everything in an eerie red glow. The station shuddered again, more violently this time. All cadets report to the main assembly hall immediately, a voice announced over the communication system. This is not a drill. All cadets report to the main assembly hall immediately. Jake and his friends joined the stream of cadets moving through the corridors. The usual chatter was replaced by worried whispers in dozens of different languages. Some of the alien cadets were making sounds Jake had never heard before. He realized they were probably expressions of fear in their native languages. The main assembly hall was chaos. Hundreds of cadets were packed into the space, all talking at once. The noise was incredible. Jake could hear the crystal beings chiming in high-pitched tones, the Moldari making bubbling sounds, and the Elonians communicating in their musical language. Professor Veltar stood on the stage at the front of the hall, his skin cycling through colors faster than Jake had ever seen. Right now, it was a deep purple, which Jake didn't recognize. Next to him stood Commander Hayes and several other instructors. Attention, cadets, Professor Veltar called out, his voice amplified by the sound system. We are experiencing an unprecedented atmospheric disturbance. The storm system currently surrounding the Academy is larger than anything in our recorded history. The hall fell silent. Jake could hear the storm raging outside, wind howling around the station's hull. The whole structure was creaking and groaning like an old house in a hurricane. Our weather prediction systems failed to detect this storm until it was too late, Professor Veltar continued. The atmospheric pressure is increasing beyond our design specifications. We are currently descending toward the planet's core. A wave of panic swept through the crowd. Jake heard several cadets cry out in their native languages. The Elonians started making a high-pitched keening sound that made his teeth ache. What does that mean? Lisa whispered. Jake knew what it meant. He had studied the Academy's basic design in his first week. The station was built to float at a specific altitude in the gas giant's atmosphere. If it went too deep, the pressure would crush it like an empty can. The evacuation pod bay has been damaged. Commander Hayes stepped forward. To speak. We have 17 functioning pods, each capable of carrying 12 beings. That's enough for approximately 200 evacuees. Jake did the math quickly. There were over 400 cadets in the Academy, plus the staff. Not everyone could be evacuated. Senior staff and essential personnel will evacuate first, Commander Hayes continued. Remaining cadets will be evacuated in order of species priority, based on galactic fleet protocols. What species priority? Pete asked. Jake had a sinking feeling he knew the answer. Humans were the newest members of the galactic community. They would be last on any priority list. The announcement continued, but Jake stopped listening. He was watching the storm through the hall's large windows. The lightning was getting brighter and more frequent. The clouds were moving in strange patterns, swirling around the station like a whirlpool. Then the lights went out again. This time, only half of them came back on. The station lurched to one side, and Jake had to grab onto a nearby railing to keep from falling. Hull breach in Section 7, a mechanical voice announced. Hull breach in Section 7. All personnel evacuate immediately. The panic in the hull got worse. Some of the cadets started pushing toward the exits. Jake saw Zixthara trying to keep her crystalline form together as other beings bumped into her. Gleep was using his tentacles to hold on to several smaller cadets who looked like they might be trampled. This is impossible, one of the Vorthan cadets was saying. Our shields should be able to handle any atmospheric disturbance. The mathematics are clear. Mathematics didn't account for this, Jake muttered. He was watching the storm patterns. Outside, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, the station shuddered again, and this time Jake heard something that made his blood run cold. It was the sound of metal tearing. Somewhere in the academy, the hull was giving way. Water in the lower levels, another announcement came. Water in the lower levels. All personnel moved to upper decks immediately. Jake's mind raced. Water meant. The station's atmospheric seals were failing. The gas giant's atmosphere was dense with moisture and chemicals. If it was getting inside the station, they didn't have much time. "We need to get out of here," he told his friends. "Where can we go?" Lisa asked. "The evacuation pods are for senior staff only." Jake looked around the hall. The instructors were herding groups of cadets toward the exits, but there was no organization. Everyone was pushing and shoving, trying to get to safety first. The alien cadets, who had seemed so advanced and sophisticated, were panicking just like anyone else would. "The storm has patterns," Jake said, more to himself than to his friends. "What?" Pete asked. "The storm!" "It's not random. Look at the way the clouds are moving." Jake pointed toward the windows. "It's like a hurricane, but much bigger. There are currents in the atmosphere, like ocean currents, but made of gas." "So what?" Lisa asked. "How does that help us?" Jake didn't answer right away. He was thinking about his grandfather's farm, about all the storms he had watched growing up. His grandfather had taught him to read the weather, to understand how storms moved and what they did. "The station isn't just falling," he said finally. "It's being carried. The storm is pushing us along atmospheric currents." Another shudder ran through the academy, stronger than before. The lights flickered again, and Jake could hear more sounds of metal straining. Through the windows, he could see that they were descending faster now. The clouds outside were getting thicker and darker. "Hull breach in Section 12, the mechanical voice announced. "Hull breach in Section 12. Structural integrity compromised." The water was getting worse. Jake could hear it sloshing somewhere below them in the emergency. Lighting was reflecting off puddles that had formed on the floor. "The station was taking on water faster than its pumps could handle. We need to find higher ground," Jake said. "The lower levels are flooding." They joined the crowd moving toward the upper decks. The corridors were packed with frightened cadets, all trying to get away from the rising water. Jake could see that some of the alien species were having trouble moving quickly. The Moldari needed to stay moist, so the flooding actually helped them, but species like the Vorthans were having difficulty. Their crystalline bodies were heavy and not designed for quick movement. The station lurched again, and Jake heard a sound that made his heart stop. It was the sound of an explosion, muffled but unmistakable. Somewhere in the academy, something had just blown up. "Power failure in main reactor," the mechanical voice announced. "Backup power activated. Estimated time remaining, 4 hours. 4 hours." Jake realized that was how long they had before the station lost all power and fell into the crushing depths of the gas giant. 4 hours to figure out how to save everyone. As they climbed toward the upper levels, Jake kept thinking about the storm patterns he had seen. There was something familiar about them, something that reminded him of weather systems back on Earth. If he was right, if the storm really was like a giant hurricane, then maybe there was a way to survive. The problem was convincing everyone else. The alien cadets were so used to relying on technology that they couldn't imagine any other solution. But Jake was starting to form an idea, a crazy idea that just might work. He just hoped he could figure it out before it was too late. The water was rising faster now. Jake stood in the main assembly hall watching the dark liquid creep across the floor. It wasn't ordinary water. The atmosphere of Narration Prime was full of chemicals that made the flooding liquid thick and oily. It smelled terrible, like rotten eggs mixed with metal. Around him, the panic was getting worse. The cadets, who had seemed so smart and advanced, were falling apart. Some were crying, others were making desperate calls to their home planets on communication devices that couldn't reach through the storm. A few had given up completely and were just sitting on the floor, staring at nothing. "The evacuation pods launched an hour ago," Lisa said, her voice shaking. They took all the senior staff and left us here. Jake nodded grimly. He had watched through the windows as the small ships disappeared into the storm. The pods were designed for short-range travel in calm conditions. He wondered if they had made it to safety or if the storm had torn them apart. How deep are we now? Pete asked. Nobody answered because nobody wanted to think about it. The station was still falling, carried by the massive air currents Jake had noticed. Through the windows, the view outside was getting darker. They were sinking into the dense layers of the gas giant's atmosphere, where the pressure would eventually crush the station like a tin can. We need to do something, Jake said. Like what? Lifa asked. We're stuck on a falling space station in the middle of a storm bigger than anything anyone has ever seen. What can we possibly do? Jake looked around the hall at the other cadets. The alien species were reacting to the crisis in different ways, all of them showing their panic. The Vorthans had gathered in a tight group near the far wall, their crystalline bodies were flashing with mathematical equations as they tried to calculate their way out of the situation. Zixtara was in the center of the group, her form blazing with complex formulas that hurt Jake's eyes to look at. But even with all their advanced math, they couldn't find a solution. The probability of survival is decreasing exponentially, Zixtara announced, her voice carrying across the hall. Based on current descent rate and structural integrity data, we have approximately 2 hours and 37 minutes before complete hull failure. Her words made the panic worse. Several cadets started crying louder, and Jake heard someone throwing up in the corner. The Moldari were having their own problems. Gleep and his species mates had tried to repair the damaged systems, but they didn't have the right tools or materials. Their tentacles were perfect for fine mechanical work, but the storm had damaged things beyond simple repair. The main power coupling is completely destroyed, Gleep reported, his translator device making his bubbling speech understandable. We would need a complete replacement unit, which we do not have. Even if we did, it would take days to install. Properly, the Elonians were perhaps the most disturbing to watch. Their telepathic abilities meant they could sense everyone's fear and panic. Kiravan was curled up in a corner, her hands pressed against her head, trying to block out the mental screams of terror from hundreds of minds. Too much fear, she whispered, cannot think, cannot reach home, too far away. Jake realized that the Elonians had been trying to call for help telepathically, but the distance to their home planet was too great. Even their advanced mental powers couldn't reach across the galaxy. Other species were showing their own forms of panic. The energy beings were flickering unstably, their forms becoming dim and scattered. The floating species were having trouble maintaining their altitude and kept bumping into the ceiling. Even the usually calm species were starting to break down. We need to stay calm, Commander Hayes announced, but Jake could hear the fear in his voice too. Help is coming. The Galactic Fleet will send rescue ships. When? Shouted one of the cadets. How long will it take them to get here? Commander Hayes didn't answer, which told Jake everything he needed to know. Even if help was coming, it wouldn't arrive in time. The station shuddered again, and Jake heard more sounds of metal tearing. The hull was failing piece by piece, and the water was rising steadily. It was already ankle-deep in most of the hull, and the current was getting stronger. We need to get to higher ground, Jake said. The upper levels might stay dry longer. Most of the cadets were already thinking the same thing. They started moving toward the exits, but the crowd was too thick and panic was making everyone push and shove. Jake saw several smaller beings get knocked down and almost trampled. Wait, Jake shouted. We need to be organized about this, or someone's going to get hurt, but nobody was listening. Fear had taken over, and each species was looking out for themselves. The stronger aliens were pushing past the weaker ones, and fights were starting to break out. Jake helped a fallen cadet to his feet and guided him toward the exit. The being looked like a cross between a bird and a lizard with colorful feathers and scales. Jake didn't know what species he was, but he was clearly terrified. Thank you, the alien said in broken Standard Galactic. I cannot swim in this liquid. My feathers will become too heavy. Jake nodded and helped him through the crowd. As they moved, Jake kept watching the storm outside. The patterns were becoming clearer to him now. The clouds were moving in huge spirals, and he could see definite currents in the atmosphere. It really was like a giant hurricane. But three-dimensional instead of flat. They reached the upper levels, but Jake could see that. Even here the water was starting to appear. The station's hull was failing in multiple places, and the poisonous atmosphere was getting inside faster than the pumps could handle it. "The water is everywhere," Pete said, looking around at the wet floors. "Nowhere is safe." Jake walked to the nearest window and pressed his face against it. The storm was incredible, bigger than anything he had imagined possible. Lightning flashed constantly, and the wind was strong enough to bend the station's metal hull. But he could see something else, too. "The storm has an eye," he said suddenly. "What?" Lisa asked. "Look at the cloud patterns. See how they're spiraling? All hurricanes have an eye in the center, a calm area where the wind is much weaker. This storm has one too, but it's huge." Jake pointed at the storm outside. If he was right, somewhere in the middle of all that chaos was a relatively calm zone. The problem was getting there. "So what?" one of the other cadets asked. "We can't fly the station." "The engines are dead. We don't need to fly," Jake said, his mind racing. "We're already being carried by the air currents. The storm is like a river, and we're floating downstream. If we can figure out how to navigate the currents, we might be able to reach the eye." The other cadets looked at him like he was crazy. Zixthara's crystalline form flashed with equations as she calculated what he was suggesting. "The mathematics are impossible," she announced. "A space station cannot be navigated like a primitive sailing vessel. We would need precise thruster control and advanced atmospheric modeling." "What if we don't need thrusters?" Jake asked. "What if we use something simpler?" "Like what?" Gleep asked, his tentacles writhing nervously. Jake was quiet for a moment, thinking. Back on Earth, people had been surviving storms for thousands of years before they had advanced technology. They had used simple tools and basic knowledge of how wind and water worked. "We build something that can float," Jake said finally. "Something that can ride the currents instead of fighting them." "You mean like a boat?" Pete asked. "Sort of. But it would have to work in gas instead of water, and it would have to be big enough to carry everyone." The alien cadets stared at him. Jake could see the disbelief in their eyes, even the ones whose faces he couldn't read. "That is the most primitive idea I have ever heard," Zixthara said. "You want to build a sailing ship to navigate an atmospheric storm?" "It's crazy," Lisa agreed. "Even if it could work, how would we build something like that? We don't have any materials." Jake looked around the flooding station. Broken pieces of equipment were floating in the water. Sections of hull plating had been torn loose by the storm. Emergency supplies were scattered everywhere. "We have lots of materials," he said. "We just need to think about how to use them." The water was still rising, and the station was still falling. Jake could feel time running out. The advanced alien technology had failed completely, and traditional solutions weren't working. But maybe, just maybe, a primitive human idea could save them all. He just had to convince everyone else to try it before it was too late. Jake waded through the rising water, collecting pieces of broken equipment. The liquid was up to his knees now, and it was getting harder to move around. The poisonous atmosphere was making the water thick and slippery, but he ignored the smell and kept working. Behind him, the other cadets watched in confusion. They thought he had lost his mind. "What are you doing?" Lisa called out. "We need to find higher ground, not collect garbage." Jake picked up a large piece of hull plating that had been torn loose by the storm. It was light but strong, made from some kind of advanced metal that could bend without breaking. Perfect for what he had in mind. "I'm building a raft," he said, dragging the metal sheet toward the center of the hull. "A raft?" Zixthara's crystalline form flashed with equations. "The atmospheric density of Narration Prime is 0.7 kilograms per cubic meter. A primitive flotation device would require a surface area of at least 2,000 square meters to support our combined mass." The structural integrity would be insufficient to withstand the pressure differentials. Jake looked at her blankly. Can you say that in normal language? She means it won't work, Pete translated. The math doesn't add up. The math is wrong, Jake said, continuing to collect materials. She's calculating for normal air. But we're not in normal air. We're in the thick atmosphere of a gas giant, and we're being carried by massive air currents. The rules are different. He found a stack of emergency supply containers. They were sealed units designed to hold food and water for long space journeys. Each one was about the size of a large suitcase and completely waterproof. Help me move these, Jake said to his friends. Lisa and Pete looked at each other then, started helping. They didn't understand what Jake was planning, but they trusted him. The three humans worked together, stacking the containers in the center of the hull. This is insane, one of the alien cadets said. Even if you could build a floating platform, how would you control it? How would you navigate through the storm? Jake wiped sweat from his forehead. The work was hard, and the thick atmosphere made it difficult to breathe. Same way people have been doing it for thousands of years. We raid the wind and water patterns. We go with the current instead of fighting it. But you cannot read atmospheric patterns, Gleep protested, his tentacles waving in agitation. You would need sophisticated instruments and computer modeling to predict the storm's behavior. No, you don't, Jake said. You just need to understand how storms work. He pointed toward the windows. The storm was still raging outside, but Jake could see the patterns now. The clouds were moving in predictable spirals, and the lightning was following specific paths through the atmosphere. See how the clouds are moving? He asked. They're not random. There are currents in the atmosphere, like rivers in the sky. If we can get into the right current, it will carry us toward the eye of the storm. The alien cadets stared at him in disbelief. The idea that anyone could navigate a storm without computers and instruments was impossible for them to understand. You want to sail into the middle of the storm? Caravan asked, her telepathic abilities picking up Jake's intentions. That is suicide. No, it's not, Jake said patiently. The eye of a hurricane is the calmest part. Once we get there, rescue ships will be able to reach us. Hurricane? Zixthara asked. What is a hurricane? Jake realized that most of the alien species had never experienced natural weather. Their planets either had no atmosphere or completely controlled climates. They had never seen storms like the ones on Earth. A hurricane is a big storm that spins in a circle, Jake explained. The outside edges have the strongest winds, but the center is calm. This storm is like a giant hurricane, but in 3 dimensions instead of flat. He continued working, using pieces of rope and cable to tie the emergency containers together. The containers would provide flotation, and the hull plating would give them a platform to stand on. It was crude, but it would work. Even if your storm theory is correct, Zixthara said, how do you propose to launch this device? The station is sealed. We cannot open the airlocks without losing atmosphere. Jake had thought about that too. We don't need to open the airlocks. The hull is already breached in dozens of places. We just need to find a big enough hole. The station shuddered again, and Jake heard another section of hull tear away. The water was rising faster now, and some of the alien cadets were starting to panic again. We're running out of time, Lisa said. The water is getting deeper. Jake looked around the hall. More cadets were starting to help, even though they didn't understand what he was doing. Fear was a powerful motivator, and his plan was the only one anyone had offered. Gleep used his tentacles to help tie the containers together. His species was good at fine work, and he could make knots that Jake couldn't even see properly. I do not understand how this will work, Gleep said, but I will help. Other cadets started bringing materials. They found more hull plating, additional containers, and lengths of cable. The alien engineering students might not understand Jake's plan, but they knew how to build things. We need something to steer with, Jake said, like a rudder. What is a rudder? One of the cadets asked. Jake looked around and spotted a large piece of equipment that had been damaged by the storm. It was flat and roughly rectangular, perfect for what he needed. That, he said, pointing. Help me get that loose. It took 6 of them to move the heavy piece of equipment, but they managed to attach it to the back of the raft. Jake used more cable to create a simple steering mechanism. It wouldn't be precise, but it would let them change direction slightly. This is still impossible, Zixthara insisted. You cannot navigate by visual observation alone. The storm is too complex. Jake straightened up and looked at her. My grandfather was a farmer on Earth. He never had weather satellites or computer models, but he could predict storms 3 days in advance just by looking at the sky. He taught me how to read the signs. That is primitive superstition, Zixthara replied. No, it's not, Jake said firmly. It's knowledge. It's understanding how natural systems work instead of just relying on computers to do the thinking for you. The water was now waist deep, and the current was getting stronger. Jake could see that they were running out of time. The station was breaking apart faster, and soon the whole structure would collapse. We need to get this thing to a breach in the hull, he said. Somewhere we can launch it. Commander Hayes, who had been quiet through most of the construction, finally spoke up. There's a major hull breach in Section 5. The hole is big enough for your raft, but the water current is very strong there. Perfect, Jake said. Strong current means we'll get carried into the storm faster. It also means we might get smashed against the hull, Lisa pointed out. Jake nodded. That's a risk. But staying here is certain death. At least this way we have a chance. The alien cadets looked at each other nervously. Jake could see the fear in their eyes, but he could also see something else. Hope. For the first time since the crisis began, someone had offered them a way out. How many can the raft carry? Pete asked. Jake did a quick count. There were about 50 cadets left in the hall, plus a few instructors. The raft was big, but it wasn't huge. We'll make it work, he said. We have to. One by one, the cadets started climbing onto the raft. It was crowded, and the platform sank lower into the water as more weight was added. But it stayed afloat, and Jake could see that his design was working. This is insane, Zixthara said, but she climbed onto the raft anyway. Yeah, Jake agreed. But sometimes insane is the only option left. The raft was loaded and ready. Now came the hardest part, getting it to the hull breach and launching it into the storm. Jake looked out at the raging winds and lightning, and for a moment he wondered if he was making a terrible mistake, but then he remembered his grandfather's words. Sometimes you have to trust the storm to carry you to safety. It was time to find out if his grandfather was right. The raft crashed through the hull breach with a sound like thunder. Jake held on tight as they were swept out into the storm. The wind hit them immediately, howling like a living thing and trying to tear them apart. The thick atmosphere of the gas giant was like being inside a tornado, but Jake had expected this. He had watched the storm patterns and knew what was coming. Hold on, he shouted over the wind. Don't let go. The 50 cadets and instructors packed onto the raft were terrified. Many of them had never experienced weather of any kind, let alone a storm like this. The alien beings were making sounds of fear in their native languages. A chorus of panic that mixed with the roar of the wind. Lightning flashed around them, huge bolts of electricity that lit up the swirling clouds. Jake could smell the ozone and feel the static in the air. The raft spun wildly as the air currents grabbed it, but Jake had built it to flex and bend rather than break. We're going to die! Someone screamed. No, we're not, Jake yelled back. This is exactly what's supposed to happen. He crawled to the back of the raft where the makeshift rudder was attached. The steering mechanism was crude, but it was working. Jake could feel the raft responding to his adjustments, turning slightly left or right as he pulled on the cables. Where are we going? Lisa asked, her voice barely audible over the storm. Jake pointed ahead, though it was hard to see anything. Through the swirling clouds. There, see that gap in the lightning? That's where the current is taking us. The raft bucked and rolled as they hit stronger turbulence. Some of the alien cadets were getting sick from the motion, but Jake ignored their distress. He was focused on reading the storm, watching the way the clouds moved and the lightning flashed. The patterns are changing, he said to Pete, who was crouched next to him. We're getting closer to the eye. How can you tell? Pete asked. Jake pointed to the lightning. See how the bolts are getting shorter? And the clouds are starting to spiral instead of just swirling around? We're following the current toward the center. The raft suddenly dropped, falling through a pocket of thinner air. Several cadets screamed as they felt weightless for a moment. Then they hit denser atmosphere again, and the raft bounced back up. This is impossible, Zixtara shouted, her crystalline form flashing with panic. No primitive device should be able to survive these conditions. It's not about the device, Jake shouted back. It's about understanding how the storm works. He pulled hard on the steering cables, turning the raft to follow a current he could see in the cloud patterns. The wind was still strong, but it was different now. Instead of trying to tear them apart, it was carrying them forward. You're actually doing it, Commander Hayes said, his voice full of amazement. You're navigating by reading the storm. Jake nodded, but he didn't take his eyes off the clouds. This was the most dangerous part. They were entering the spiral arms of the storm, where the winds were strongest and most unpredictable. One wrong move could send them spinning out of control. Everyone stay low, Jake ordered, and keep holding on. The raft hit another current, and suddenly they were moving much faster. Jake could feel the acceleration as they were swept along by the massive airflow. The storm was like a river, and they were riding the rapids. Gleep used his tentacles to help steady some of the smaller cadets who were having trouble holding on. Despite his fear, the Moldari was trying to help others. How much longer? He asked. Not long, Jake replied. Look ahead. The clouds are getting lighter. It was true. The dense, dark clouds around them were starting to thin out. The lightning was becoming less frequent, and the wind was starting to calm down. They were entering the eye of the storm. It's working, Lisa said, her voice full of wonder. Your crazy plan is actually working. The raft broke through the last layer of storm clouds, and suddenly they were in a different world. The eye of the storm was huge, a cylindrical space surrounded by towering walls of clouds. The wind was almost calm here, just a gentle breeze that barely moved the raft. Incredible, Caravan whispered. Her telepathic abilities were working again now that the electrical interference from the lightning had stopped. I can sense other minds. Rescue ships are coming. Jake looked up and saw them. 3 galactic fleet vessels were descending through the calm air of the eye, their hulls gleaming in the strange light that filtered through the storm walls. They had made it. They were safe. How did you know? Zixtara asked as the rescue ships approached. How did you know this would work? Jake smiled tiredly. My grandfather taught me that storms aren't random. They follow patterns, and if you understand the patterns, you can work with them instead of against them. But you had no instruments. No computer models, Zixtara protested. How could you navigate without data? I had data, Jake said. I just got it by watching and listening instead of reading it on a screen. The first rescue ship extended a docking tube toward the raft. Jake could see the faces of the crew through the windows, their expressions amazed and relieved. They had found the survivors against all odds. You saved us all? Commander Hayes said as they prepared to board the rescue ship. You're primitive. Methods worked better than our advanced technology. They're not primitive, Jake replied. They're just different. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways. As the cadets filed onto the rescue ship, Jake took one last look at the storm around them. The eye was beautiful in its own way, a peaceful space in the middle of chaos. The towering walls of clouds rose up on all sides, lit by flashes of lightning that looked like fireworks from this distance. Jake, Lisa said from the airlock, come on, time to go. Jake nodded and followed her onto the ship. Behind them, the makeshift raft floated in the calm air, a simple creation that had accomplished something impossible. It had carried 50 beings through the most dangerous storm in recorded galactic history. Using nothing but basic physics and one human's understanding of weather patterns, the rescue ship's captain, a being from the Centauri Republic, greeted them as they came aboard. I don't understand how you survived, he said. Our computer said it was impossible to navigate that storm. Your computers were wrong, Jake replied simply. news of the rescue spread quickly through the galactic fleet. The story of the human cadet who had built a raft and sailed through an impossible storm became legendary. Jake found himself famous throughout the galaxy, invited to speak at academies and conferences, but the real change was in how the galaxy viewed humans. Before the storm, they had been seen as primitive newcomers who had little to contribute to galactic civilization. After the storm, they were recognized as having something valuable that the advanced species had lost: the ability to think simply and solve problems without relying on complex technology. Primitive problem-solving became a required course at every Galactic Fleet Academy. The class was renamed Applied Human Logic and taught by human instructors, who emphasized practical thinking over technological solutions. Jake returned to the rebuilt Apapler Academy as an instructor. His first lesson was always the same. Sometimes the most advanced solution is the simplest one. Zixthara, who had become his closest friend among the alien cadets, was now his teaching assistant. She had learned to appreciate human methods, even if she still didn't fully understand them. "The mathematics still don't make sense," she would often say about Jake's weather predictions. "That's because you're trying to calculate something that needs to be felt," Jake would reply. "Some things can't be reduced to numbers." The storm on Narration Prime was later studied by scientists from across the galaxy. They discovered that Jake had been right about the atmospheric currents and the eye wall phenomenon. His simple observations had been more accurate than their sophisticated computer models, but Jake knew that wasn't the real lesson. The real lesson was that different species brought different strengths to the galaxy. Humans might not have the most advanced technology, but they had something equally valuable: the wisdom to know that sometimes the old ways still worked best. The galaxy was starting to learn that lesson too. And that made all the difference.